I'm going to let our BikeWorks Executive Director, Deb Sauls, just introduce us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. We're so grateful that Tessa is being willing to present to us tonight. And as you may know, BikeWorks' mission is to promote the bicycle as a vehicle for change, to empower youth and build resilient communities. So the bike as a tool for activism and change is what we're all about. And a little bit about us: we have youth riding and repair programs and adult repair classes and volunteer opportunities. And during COVID, we've really been focusing a lot on bike giveaways and free bike repair out in the community with our bike mobile. We also have a social enterprise bike shop that maybe you've visited down in Columbia City. And it is still open for repairs, and a web store is open for any kind of sales. And also we have a really robust recycle reuse program where we're always trying to bring in more bikes. You can donate bikes to us, process over 7,000 bikes a year, getting them refurbished and distributing them out to the community. You can find all that information about us and more on our website at bikeworks.org. But I'll just turn it back over to Elise to get us toward the presentation.
Awesome, thank you, Deb. Let's go ahead and we're gonna do a quick poll just to get a feel of who's in the room. So we're gonna initiate the poll now, and the poll is specifically about whether you feel that you've used your bicycle as a tool for activism this year. And so this is a multiple choice question. You can go ahead and fill it out now, and then we'd love to hear your stories about how you've done that or the different ways that you think that can be done in the chat. So please go ahead and fill out the poll and share your stories in the chat as well about what bicycle activism or the other types of activism that you do in other realms of your life. So we'll give just another 30 seconds to fill that out. Looks like we have some members of the Seattle Bike Brigade in the house tonight, which is awesome. Y'all are doing great work out there. Peace Peloton as well. I think many of you are Peace Peloton riders and organizers. If you're not familiar, the Peace Peloton is a group ride designed to promote economic reform for Black folks. So they tend to start at Black-owned businesses and patronize the restaurant or the shop, and then have different speakers kind of along the bike route. So it's community building and all access group ride as well. Great, so we have 90% of our votes in, so let's go ahead and end the poll. And it looks like 40% of you have used the bicycle as a vehicle for activism, which is awesome, and a lot of folks are letting us know how they do that in the chat, and some other types of activists in the room. And at BikeWorks, we definitely do believe that just riding a bike does count as activism. You're participating in safe streets activism and environmentalism, so that was a trick question. Riding definitely does count. Oh, I need to share the results for you to see them. There you go. 40%, and then another 30% are riders who are doing this work, and then at least one person who's doing other types of activism. Okay, I'm going to stop the poll now. Thank you, Jess, for that. Moving on, I just wanted to also acknowledge tonight that those of us in Seattle are on Duwamish native lands. And so if you'd like to make rent payments directly to the Duwamish tribe, you can do that at realrentduwamish.org. They're an organization that helps to support the revival of Duwamish culture and the vitality of the Duwamish tribe. A lot of members of BikeWorks do pay rent directly to the Duwamish this way, and we encourage anybody who lives here to do the same, or just to learn more about the Duwamish tribe. And if you're not in Seattle, we do have another resource, a great land map that we're sharing in the chat as well, where you can learn about the lands that you might be occupying or recreating on, to learn more about the people who traditionally lived there, and to do more to try to break down colonialism and support Native people. Moving right along, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our very special guest presenter tonight. Tessa Hulls is an artist, a writer, an adventurer, a bibliophile, a researcher, cook, feminist historian, and a bike explorer. Tonight, she will be presenting her research into the historical role of bicycles as a tool for activism to promote racial, gender, and environmental justice. So thank you so much, Tessa, for being here, and I will let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for hosting me. I'm really excited to be doing this. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. And so the talk that I'm going to give tonight, it's an adapted version of a talk that I've been traveling with for the last couple of years. And then I went down a research rabbit hole to find some new material. So we're going to see how long it is. I haven't done a full run through yet. So let's just jump in. All right, so my niche as an activist is very much as an historian. So we're gonna kick this off with a little bit of the history of the bicycle. So the first thing that resembles a bicycle first shows up in the 1500s, but for our intents and purposes, the bike is really invented in 1817, where we have this device called a draisine. And at this point, the bicycle has no drivetrain and it doesn't have pedals. So you just push it by putting your feet against the ground like a Fred Flintstone car. And in the 1850s, somebody adds pedals to this thing and it's renamed the velocipede. So at this point, the wheels are still made out of metal or wood, and they're called bone shakers for obvious reasons. The next evolution in technology comes along.
Sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your slides. We're seeing a black screen. Do you want to try resharing your screen?
That's no good. Let's try that again. Do you see it now?
That's better.
Okay, we're good. So yes, 1817, draisine is invented. 1870s, we see the penny farthing come along, and it's also known as the ordinary. So interesting thing about this design is that each wheel has to be custom built for its rider because the size of the wheel has to fit their inseam. So you could only ride a bike that was built specifically for you. But when things really change and we see the modern bicycle is in 1885, where we see the invention of what's known as the safety. And this is the first time that we start to see a device that has pedals, two wheels of the same size, a drivetrain, and the ability to steer. So at this point, there's still no brakes. We're still a little ways out from that. But basically, this is when we see.
But I think we're just seeing the first slide that you put on. It's not moving.
Are you seeing any changes now?
No.
What's happening? Okay, let me see what's going on here. Stand by.
We can see your image of the bicycles in 1817, 1870s, and 85.
Okay,
now.
Let me try new share. Let's try this again. All right, hitting play. All right. We seeing First Bicycle Club, 1878?
Yes.
Okay. Well, actually, we didn't want that quite yet. Wait, now it's not letting me advance. Ugh, technical issues. I don't know why it's doing this. I've lost control of it. Okay. All right. We'll see how this goes. So what we have to keep in mind at this time is that up until now, the only form of reliable long distance transportation is the horse, and horses are really expensive to own. And so transportation is essentially only available for the wealthy upper class, and the only people who are really able to leave their homes are men. So when bikes first hit the scene, they're really expensive, but the price drops really quickly. And by the 1880s or so, they're starting to be pretty affordable and accessible. And so in the 1890s, we see the whole country go bicycle crazy. So in 1878, the first bicycle club is founded. And then in 1880, we see the founding of the League of American Wheelmen. And this organization still exists today. It's been renamed the League of American Bicyclists. And they formed as an advocacy organization. And they had the realization that if they wanted to ride this new toy that they had, the best way that they were going to be able to do that was by advocating for better road infrastructure. So kind of the current situation we find ourselves in, where bicycle advocacy often centers around wealthy white men trying to make infrastructure improvements, this actually goes back to the 1880s and how the League of American Wheelmen was first founded. They had a lot of clever ways of getting the word out about their mission, and this is a picture of probably my favorite. You could buy a chest protector for your horse. This horse is wearing a necklace that says, "I want good roads," so you could advertise while you were out riding. In 1882, Wheelman magazine is founded, and this is basically the first sporting magazine, and it becomes Outing magazine, which is the most influential sporting magazine for a very long time to come. But this golden era was very short-lived. It started in 1885 with the mass production of the safety, but it waned within about 20 years. And in 1908, we see the nail in the coffin on that. And can I get some guesses as to what happens in 1908? Somebody will have to tell me what people are saying in the chat. I can't see.
We've got 2 for cars, 3 for cars.
Yeah, it's not really, it's a trick question. Ugh, I lost control of advancing my slides again. What is going on? Okay, here we go. Yeah, the Ford Model T rolls off the assembly line in 1908. And basically this beautiful moment where the bicycle was going to remake the infrastructure of American cities is dead and over. But there's another timeline that I want to look at. And we're going to go back.
And then this right here is where you can see everybody who's responded.
Sounds like someone might need to mute themselves.
Can't actually, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in 1830, the Indian Exclusion Act is signed, and that begins 20 years of forced relocations known as the Trail of Tears. In 1861 to 1865, the United States is at civil war over the right to own slaves. 1877 kicks off the Jim Crow era in the segregated South. 1882, we see the Chinese Exclusion Act signed. In 1893, we see the Riverside Cycling Club, founded as the first African-American cycling club. And in 1894, the League of American Wheelmen votes to only allow white members. But there's another timeline I want us to take a look at. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton organizes the Seneca Falls Convention, which is widely seen as the beginning of the women's rights movement. In 1849, the Lily, the first US newspaper edited for and by women, begins publication. And this is its masthead. You can see "devoted to the interests of women" as its tagline. In 1857, the Rational Dress Reform Association is founded, and the American branch of this organization didn't have a specific demand, but their counterparts over in England were advocating for the radical goal of having women's underwear weigh less than 7 pounds. So just for context, a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. So they wanted women's underwear to weigh slightly less than a gallon of water. And both the Lily and the Rational Dress movement were heavily influenced by the same woman, Amelia Bloomer. And you probably know her because of bloomers, which are short gathered pants that women began to wear to ride bicycles. But she has a much more interesting story than that. And she was born in 1818 with only a few years of education, but she became the first woman to own and operate a publishing company. And this is a quote from her about bloomers. "The costume of women should be suited to her wants and necessities. It should conduce at once to her health, comfort, and usefulness. And while it should not fail also to conduce to her personal adornment, it should make that end of secondary importance." So from a contemporary standpoint, that sounds pretty reasonable. It's not asking for anything too wild. But the men at the time were just outraged over this. And so this was the response from the editorial board of the New York Times in 1852. These ladies assert their claim to rights, which we, if by bifurcated raiment, are charged with usurping. They design to evict us. They will enter perforce the walks of fame and honor and wealth we now occupy to compete with us and strip us of our present monopoly. So basically they're saying, first they're gonna come for our pants, then they're gonna come for our power. And yep, pretty much that was exactly what they were after. So at this point, this dress reform begins to really change how we see depictions of femininity. And we start to see women experimenting with basically dressing like men. And these are a couple of primary sources from that era. So this one is The Bicycle, the Great Dress Reformer of the 19th Century. This is a comic. Isn't heaven in there? Yes, but this is the ladies' entrance. And we really start to see some interesting examples of women playing around with traditionally male gender roles. This is another comic from this era. The mob object to a lady cyclist wearing socks. She flies for refuge into a cafe. But going back to our timeline, in 1869, the Women's Suffrage Association is formed, and there are a lot of connections between the bicycle and women's suffrage. These are some pictures from some of those first protests. And what you see is that bicycles appear in a lot of these images because this push for women to receive the vote was happening at a time while they were having agency over their own transportation for the first time. And you could see, this is from over in the UK, rows of women on bicycles. One of them has a placard saying the new slavery around one of their handlebars. And this is a picture, people were talking about Seattle Bike Brigade in the chat, and just to show how people have been using bikes to blockade traffic and grab political attention. This is a comic from over in England of, the comic says, suffragette cyclists hold up Mr. Winston Churchill by flinging themselves in front of his motor car. This risky proceeding was carried out last week as a fresh development of militant tactics. So this is a very old practice of activists corking to block cars and get attention this way. This is another comic from the era of international suffrage. This is from New Zealand, where basically this antiquated penny farthing is shown as being this idea that only men should have voting rights, and the new modern safety is equity. A couple figures from over in the UK. This is Flora Drummond. She was known as the General because she liked to wear military garb, and she was in charge of this organization called the Women's Cycle Scouts. And so what would happen is every week a group of women would get together on bicycles in urban centers, and they would ride out to nearby towns to spread the vote to people who might not be able to come hear about the suffrage movement in the city. And this is a picture of her getting arrested. And I love this because she just is so joyous, and obviously it's just like, whatever, this is a part of this. And she got arrested 9 times protesting. This is another woman from over in England. This is Rosa Mae Billinghurst, and she was best known as the cripple suffragette. And she would take her wheeled tricycle to protests, and she would hide rocks under a blanket so she could throw them at crowds. So again, this was happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s, not a new tactic. And there are records and news stories of her being knocked from her chair by the police and left there without them helping her up. So, yep, this goes back a long time. All right. In 1895, the Wheel Woman magazine was founded, and this was basically had the tagline of dedicated to the conversion of women who don't ride the wheel. And just to kind of give you an idea of what gender figures looked like during this era, there really weren't very much representation. And this is taken from a book about the 1890s cycling craze. Also in 1897, when Cambridge moved to allow women access to education, there was such a huge protest that that the Central Square was packed, and all of these men, the way that they decided to protest the inclusion of women for education was by hanging an effigy of a woman on a bicycle, because that's what they felt represented of free women. And just another shot from this crowd scene, because it's such an incredible picture, you can sort of see how big this protest was. Also in 1897, the League of American Wheelmen still had in its bylaws that no race that allowed female competitors would receive official sanction. So I'm just going to go quickly into the lives of some of the figures from this era. Again, this is taken from a much longer talk, so this is a little bit out of context, but this is Maria Ward, and she was the editor of an 1886 book called Bicycling for Ladies. And she said that if women had the dexterity to mend clothes and sew on buttons and cook food, then there was absolutely no reason they shouldn't be able to use tools and work on their own bikes. So she made this book where all of the models were women using tools, and she was basically saying there is no reason you can't turn these household skills towards being your own mechanic. And one of the most interesting things from this book is that she hired a female gymnast to serve as a model, and they went through all these different riding techniques and had pictures of it. The woman who took those pictures was Alice Austin, and she is a photographer who didn't receive very much recognition while she was alive, but she would bike around with 50 pounds of camera equipment on her bicycle, and she's now recognized as being one of the pioneers of photojournalism. And part of what she did, in addition to taking images of cyclists, is she did a lot of work that really explored the idea of what gender and power could be. So these are a couple of the images from that Bicycling for Ladies book. And this one's my favorite because it's proto-Photoshop. So this is the image from the photo shoot itself. And then this is how it appeared in the book. These are a couple of her other images. This one is called The Darned Club. And Alice had a lifelong female friend because during this era, it really was not safe to be able to say that you were in a lesbian relationship. But through her work, it's really clear that she was always looking at this idea of basically what was gender and who was allowed to love. This is a picture of her and her friends cross-dressing, again, exploring gender roles. This is Frances Benjamin Johnston. She was also a photographer, and this is a self-portrait she took on a timer. She worked out of Washington, D.C., and was the only female photographer in the city. And she is best known for this self-portrait she took of herself as, quote, the new woman. And this is a trope that we start to see emerge in the early 1900s, where you have these educated women who are pushing for more freedom within society and basically won't stay in their lane. And here are a couple other images from that. You'll notice in the background a bicycle behind this woman's knee. Another depiction of the free woman. And I love this one. The caption says, "Sew on your own buttons, I'm going for a ride." She also advocated for the fact that women could have freelance careers. And so she wrote a series of newspaper articles basically encouraging women to monetize things like photography and writing to be able to support themselves. And she actually went on to become the official White House press photographer for 5 different presidents. This is Fannie Bullock Workman, and she was kind of a polymath who did a number of different things. She was a climber, a geographer, a cartographer, and she and her husband, William Hunter Workman, went on a series of really long bicycle trips and co-authored 8 books about those adventures. The longest and most ambitious of those was Through Town and Jungle, 14,000 miles a wheel among the temples and people of the Indian Plain. And so that was a journey that took multiple years, and they started at the southernmost tip of the Indian continent and biked until they hit the Himalayas, at which point they swapped out wheels for climbing equipment and went into the mountains where Fannie set a series of altitude records that stood for over 20 years. And what's so interesting about her is that she grew up climbing in New England, and it was surprisingly progressive during that era. And so she grew up climbing in the company of co-ed groups, and that made her decide that she always wanted to pair her outdoor pursuits with gender activism. This is the most famous picture of her. She is at 21,000 feet of elevation, and she's holding a newspaper with the headline "Votes for Women." And after she died, she left large endowments. And so to this day, there's still 4 colleges in New England that have scholarships in her name. This is Tilly Anderson. She was better known as the Terrible Swede, and she was part of these really famous 6-day races that were very popular. That's a whole other tangent I don't have time to go into now, but I really suggest looking into it because it's a fascinating era of racing. And they were basically these like very small tracks where sometimes the laps would only take 16 seconds and they were very competitive and 10,000 people would come out and watch. But the reason that I wanted to talk about Tilly briefly is because female racers were kind of put in this impossible situation where they were essentially the first female athletes. And they had to walk this really fine line between being athletic, but also still being seen as feminine and beautiful and available. And so Tilly actually lied about the fact that she was married and referred to her husband as her brother so that the press could still sort of write about her as being available, beguiling female. And this is an image kind of speaking to this tension between femininity and athleticism, where there's this phenomenon called bicycle face, where basically if women are riding hard, they're gonna become horrible ghouls. And this is an illustration of all of these female racers before racing. And then this is the after picture of what racing does to them. This is Frances Willard, and she was the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So she did a lot of work around women's suffrage and temperance, but she also contributed towards establishing statutory rape laws and the 8-hour workday, and was an activist in many different areas of her life. This is a picture of her working with documents towards women's suffrage. And she's in this talk because at the age of 53, kind of when the bicycle craze was really taking off, she decided that she wanted to experience the freedom of riding a bike. And so again, at 53, she got a bicycle, named her Gladys, and decided that she was going to learn to ride the wheel. And she was talking about the fact that she basically lost her freedom at the age of 16, where she became a woman and was suddenly put into corsets and wasn't allowed to have freedom to just go about the world. And she wrote a really amazing book called A Wheel Within the Wheel about this experience. And she had a slogan for the Women's Christian Temperance Union that was "do everything." And what she meant by that was that we need to do everything within our power to fight for the world that we want to see. And this is a really wonderful quote from her. "The world is wide, and I will not waste my life in friction when it could be turned into momentum." So I want to go into this other timeline that I've touched on, where we have the history of the bicycle, and then we kind of have these figures and landmarks in gender rights happening at the same time. And then we also have what was going on in terms of civil rights and racism in this country. And I tried to, this is basically the condensed poster version of this whole talk, which actually I can make this available as a Google Doc if anyone wants it, to go into this in a little bit more detail. But when I first put this talk together, it was a couple of years ago, and initially I was asked by an organization called the WTF Bike Explorers, and so my research was mostly focused on gender, but right now that is very much not the focus, and a lot of feminism, especially white feminism, has had a really poor history of being intersectional in the ways in which they apply their activism. So I just wanted to take a moment to say that I think it's really important that if we're talking about systems of oppression, we can't just focus on gender. We have to focus on gender and race because they're very much entwined. And to sort of speak to this point, this is a picture from the Utah Senate building in, I believe, 1896. And you will see one of these things is not like the other. You know, you have a whole array of white men and then a woman on a bicycle on the bottom left corner. And I want to talk about why representation is so important. Representation is what allows for control of narrative, and control of narrative is control of culture, and control of culture is, of course, control of power and who is allowed to hold it. So for the purpose of what I've shown you so far, it's focused on gender, but everything that I'm saying about women is exactly applicable to talking about race and about the rights of people of color, and this idea of who is and is not allowed autonomy and freedom of movement within society. So this is a quote that I think is equally applicable from Munsey magazine in the late 1800s. "To men, the bicycle in the beginning was merely a new toy, another machine added to the long list of devices they knew in their work and play. To women, and for people of color, it was a steed upon which they rode into the new world. So basically this idea was that when the bicycle entered the scene, it changed the roles and rules of how people were allowed to move through society. So this is a comic thrashed by a lady cyclist who is noted for her athletic prowess. And this was something that actually was written as a police report because a man had been harassing this female cyclist for being on a bike, and she was having a day and jumped off and punched him. And this is probably my favorite illustrated police report ever. This is another comic, The Awful Effects of Velocipeding, where there was all of this fear that if people who hadn't had power were suddenly allowed these new tools, they were basically going to stop playing nice by society's rules. Oh, I've lost advancing ability again. Oh, there we go. So I want to dig into what I could find about the history of people of color and bicycles. And there's unfortunately really not that much available. I'm sure that there are more images if somebody were to go basically in person, go to analog archives and start slogging through them. But if you look on the internet, you basically are going to find the same very small subset of pictures. And sadly, we don't really know the stories behind these individuals, and we have the record of their images, but not very much is known about their lives. There are a couple of exceptions, so I'm going to go into some of the stories that we do know of people of color in this era. Has anyone here heard about the Buffalo Soldiers, or kind of knows what that history is? Kind of just see in the chat, I'm just curious if people sort of know what that was.
Yes.
Okay, somebody said yes. So one of the most well-known, this was basically the idea that there were these Black military troops. And one of the most famous was the Tuskegee Airmen, who were the all-Black pilots. And lesser known is the 25th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Bicycle Brigade. So there was an all-Black bike brigade in the 1890s, and these are some images of them. And this is a picture of them not on their bikes. Also, little known fact that I only found out this year through something unrelated, Tacoma has the only museum in the country that is dedicated to the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. So they're closed right now because of COVID, but that is in our own backyard. So there was basically this era where the military thought that the bicycle was going to be a new tool of war. And so to prove that this was something that would be useful with military applications, one of the white leaders of this all-Black regiment decided that he needed to demonstrate that you could go long distances by bike. So in 1896, this regiment went on this trip where, as their proof of concept, they did an 800-mile ride. And these were the bikes that they were on. They had these custom-built diamond frame bags, and they were carrying about 55 pounds of gear. And they set off to prove that this was possible. They were trying to do about 50 miles a day. And for the most part, they were able to do that. And then their biggest test was a 1,900-mile trip from Montana to Missouri, which they did successfully complete. But the terrain was such that they estimated that they were walking their bicycles for 300 or 400 of those miles. So it was a bit of a slog. Another story where we do actually know a little bit about the individuals. This is a picture from 1928, and this is a group of 5 Black women who went on a 250-mile ride out of New York. When asked why they did it, they said it was for their love of the great outdoors and to show what Black women were capable of. And then this is Major Taylor, who we'll be going into a little bit more when Ed talks. But Major Taylor was basically the first Black sports star, and he became a world champion despite the fact that he was racing in the Jim Crow South. And this is a picture of his racing team in 1897, I believe, and it was the first integrated sports team. That's not to say he didn't face enormous racism. These are some comics that came out from this era. And there are stories of basically just the unimaginable racism that he faced when he was racing, where he actually had one of his competitors after a race tackle him and choke him to unconsciousness. And the person who did that was fined $50, but he was allowed to continue racing and face no repercussions. So Major Taylor eventually retired at the age of 32, citing exhaustion, which seems pretty understandable. And this is a statue of him in his hometown in Massachusetts. This is Kitty Knox, and she was a cyclist in Boston, and she was a strong rider who competed in multiple centuries. So she did 100-mile races, and she often beat many of the men. So there's a record of her coming in 12th out of a pack of 50 in a co-ed century race. And she once won a best dressed costume for her hand-sewn cycling clothes. But whenever the press talked about her, it never focused on her riding abilities. And instead, it always focused on her race. So these are some things she was called in the press: comely colored girl, beautiful and buxom black bloomerette, comely colored maiden, saddle colored damsel, a mulatto of striking and attractive feature, light-skinned mulatto. And one of the main stories around her comes from, she was a card-carrying member of the League of American Wheelmen. And when she went to attend their annual ball in Ashbury Park, she was turned away because of her race in spite of being a member. And what that really kicked off was a debate over who was allowed to belong, because the League of American Wheelmen had adopted this whites-only color ban. And she sadly died at a very young age, so wasn't really able to realize her full potential. And her story wasn't really known until a historian named Lawrence Finnison dug it up. And eventually this unmarked grave that she had been buried in was replaced with a headstone that honored the contributions of her life. I want to talk a little bit more about the climate that she was facing as a Black cyclist during this era. Again, with the idea of white feminism not really supporting women of color, while they were using the bicycle as a tool for their own liberation, they were also, you will see in the minutes from one of their meetings, they were holding minstrel shows. So this is actually the meeting notes from one of their gatherings. I'm not going to read these out loud, but just kind of shows you how they were extremely racist, even as they were fighting for their own rights with the bicycle. And these are some comics directly referencing this incident with Kitty Knox and not being able to attend the ball at Ashbury Park. This here is showing the League of American Wheelmen kicking out Black members. This is another comic relating to this. You'll see in the right hand of the Black man, he's holding a knife, and the caption is basically saying, all right, white man, how are you gonna vote? And he is being threatened with a knife. And the white man is basically in fear, saying, oh, I think I'll vote for the fraternization of the pigmented velocipedist. And again, some more comics that I managed to dig up, just kind of showing how accepted racism was in this era depicting Black cyclists. And this one, the caption's kind of too small to read, but you know, it's just really racist stereotypes of these Black individuals thinking that they've seen Satan himself because they're scared of seeing this white man on this new invention, the bicycle. So going into the present and kind of how I ended up giving this talk tonight, I have been trying to use my role as a comics activist to make comics around themes of racial equity. And so I've been doing these as a monthly series, and what I kicked them off with was this one on the past and present of bikes and Black liberation. Because it seemed like kind of an intersection of a way to take this body of knowledge that I've been researching while hopefully being of concrete use. So these are a couple pages from this comic I drew. This is of Major Taylor, kind of went into his story a little bit. And this is a comic of Ed down in the bottom. That's how we crossed paths as I interviewed him, wanting to know more about the Major Taylor project, which he'll speak to in a bit. Again, Peace Peloton has been mentioned. I talked to Doc about that, and this is kind of a comic about what he is up to there. And I also talked to a group of Portland organizers who do an annual Juneteenth ride where they go to Black-owned businesses and landmarks and kind of try and talk about the history of gentrification in their city. Unfortunately, they had a really awful incident happen this past year where they had 2 different hit and runs. With cars plowing into their riders. And then with these resource guides that I'm making the last page for each of them basically a way for people to do a deeper dive into some of the information that is impossible to cover in a 9-page comic. So I'm just going to end with talking about what sort of led me to this particular niche. Back in 2011, I went on a very long bicycle ride from Southern California to Maine. I did it alone. Yep, Honey Squeeze Bear and Good Luck Navigator Kitty Squeaky Horn, just the 3 of us. As a daughter of immigrants, I was searching for a sense of home. I spent 5,000 miles falling in love with the enormity of my country. I experienced an impossible level of generosity as people shared their homes, food, and stories. And I drank in the rich complexity of lives, perspectives, and experiences wildly unlike my own. But every day someone would tell me the same thing. A woman can't travel alone. My own life didn't carry enough weight to serve as a counter-argument, but I just did. I went on to bike in Ghana, Mexico, Cuba, and Alaska. Still not enough. So I started collecting 150 years of evidence. I found extraordinary strength in learning about extraordinary women who led their own lives. And I found even more strength in sharing those stories so other women could feel free. What began as an act of passionate frustration became my profession. Bessie Coleman, first female African-American pilot. Fannie Bullock Workman, mountaineer, continent-crossing bike traveler, cartographer, suffragist, lecturer, and author. The great Sandwina, circus strongwoman who defeated the reigning strongman of the era. Ada Blackjack, a Nupiaq woman called the female Robinson Crusoe. These days, when someone tells me what a woman can't do, I feel methodically researched glee over getting to prove them very, very wrong. And so with that, we're gonna shift to the conversation part of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Tessa, so much. Super powerful stuff. I'm going to share a link to the comic that Tessa just shared about her own experience in the chat, and we'll do that in the follow-up as well. And I'd like to just turn it over to Ed now to speak a little bit more about the Major Taylor Project, as long as we're kind of in the realm of talking about the bicycle as a tool for activism in sort of the modern era.
Sure, thank you, Elise, and thank you, Tessa. Really enjoyed that, and it really took me back to why I do what I do. And I didn't set out in my teenage years to become an activist. I always refer to myself as an accidental activist, but I remember the feeling of being 14 or 15 and going into a bike shop where no one looks like me, going to my first racing training ride where no one talked to me, going to my first bike race where, again, no one talked to me, no one introduced themselves to me. And but I always had two parents to unpack that with. Still to this day at 55, those feelings are very vivid. And honestly, that was the impetus for starting Major Taylor. I knew what my parents provided, my brother and I wanted that same possibility for other youth that looked like me. And I also felt it was a responsibility to prepare that youth or those youth for what they will experience, even with something that they love and that brings them joy, the bike. And that there's some people that don't want them there, that don't want them on a bike, that don't understand that they can ride a bike, that don't understand that they have the ability to ride a bike. So that really is the fuel that started Major Taylor, and it's the fuel that has really carried me to BikeWorks in this role as deputy director. It's the fuel that has helped me partner with friends like Doc to help him start the Peace Peloton, to be an inclusive community. And it just really brings me a lot of joy that it is so successful. It really brings me a lot of joy that the Major Taylor Project is still going strong. It's almost 15 years old. For those of you who are not familiar with the Major Taylor Project, it was an initiative that was started at Cascade Bicycle Club in 2007. It was a very basic bike riding curriculum, and I was hired to start the project and develop it. And it was very easy to identify where to embed this initiative, because Seattle is a beautiful place. It's also a very segregated place. So Tukwila, White Center, Rainier Beach, even parts of West Seattle, Delridge, and Tacoma. So it was very easy to identify where the need was. But it was much more than just an after-school riding program. It was also a way to introduce students to a bigger part of the world. It was also to start a bigger conversation about what's going on in these communities. If the students don't have access to a bike, and there's very extreme high rates of free reduced lunch, you can imagine what else they don't have access to. And so that's the real conversation. The bike was just a very neutral, a very passive protest, if you will, to drive a larger conversation of what's needed in these communities. There was also an effort to share with the students what they want to do with the bicycle. So they were introduced into bike touring, bike racing, cyclocross, and then there's one big event that happens in the Northwest every year called the Seattle to Portland Ride. And so I picked that ride not only for a challenge for the students, but also to bring attention to what these kids are prepared to do. I also felt there was a responsibility to make sure that the students were prepared physically and mentally for what they're about to run into. Not only is it 200 miles, but there's going to be 10,000 people that don't look like them. And so what that feels like, and having deliberate conversations with them, how that feels, making sure they have questions. So that was, I'd say, the biggest silent act of protest, is to have 75 students, Black and brown students, ride 200 miles, thriving, and getting to Portland, then asking what's next. And that really started to turn heads of the general community of it's not just the bike, it's not just the accomplishment of the ride, it's these students are good students, they can do this, and they're asking what else can the bike do for them? What else can the bike get them into college? Can the bike help them find a job? Can the bike help them relieve stress of just being a Black and brown youth in Seattle? And so that's basically the impetus. And so my journey really started out as not an activist per se, but just remembering what it felt like to be excluded. And then also remembering the positive reinforcement and the support and the modeling that my parents provided for me and my brother. And then wanted to provide that, making sure that that was provided for the students that we reached through the Major Taylor Project. Year to date, the Major Taylor Project has reached over 6,000 youth in Seattle and Tacoma. It's generated probably over $5 million for these students. Over 500, almost 600 students have completed the STP. And also another goal for me was, I don't care if the students never pick up the bike, but if they really experience something about themselves that they can carry throughout their lives, then my work and the job of the Major Taylor Project is done. I see that same possibility and the same future for youth that we work with at BikeWorks. It's the same spirit. It's a choice. So that's, I don't consider myself an activist. I just consider myself as being blessed with very, very strong parents and being able to pay that forward.
Thank you, Ed, for sharing all of your stories. Really powerful stuff. And I hope that the handful of folks who maybe at the beginning of this presentation weren't sure quite what the connection between bicycles and activism could be, maybe got some of those questions answered. And also, I just want to highlight that both Ed's story and a lot of the stories from the women and people of color who Tessa was highlighting very much just kind of demonstrates that when you're a member of a marginalized group, just doing the thing you want to do sort of becomes activism, and you're sort of forced to be an activist just by living and thriving and recreating. And so I just wanted to name that. That can show up in many different ways. I'm sure a lot of us have sort of had that experience in different ways, or maybe kind of never had to think about just living as being activism. So thank you for being so vulnerable and for sharing with us, Ed. So I am going to open up the floor for questions. If you could just say that you have a question in the chat, we'll spotlight you and let you ask your question to Tessa or to Ed yourself. And I know that we have 4 minutes into the hour, so I think we're just going to go ahead and take as many questions as we can. Totally respect everybody's time if you need to leave right at 7, but we'll probably take a few questions and go over time just a little bit. So happy to start that now. If you want to just in the chat, let us know, and we'll call on you.
I could quickly actually just say a couple other, people mentioned Peace Peloton. There are some other BIPOC riding groups in Seattle that I just love people to know about. There's a new one that started called the North Star Cycling Club. And then there's also Friends on Bikes, which started in Portland and is just kind of getting rolling again in Seattle. And that's for women and gender nonconforming people of color to get up and ride. So yeah, please do spread the word that there are lots of options for Black and brown folks to get together and ride bikes in the area.
Awesome. And we will send everybody an email with Tessa's reading list to continue your own education about this topic and some other resources as well. Tessa, can you tell us where you found all of those wild images of cyclists in the 1800s?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is obviously just online and a lot of deep diving, but I'm a really voracious reader. And so I try and go to the primary sources whenever possible. And since all of them are very long out of copyright, a lot of these texts, especially from Fannie, Bullock, Workman, and then some other women I didn't put into this kind of truncated presentation, their books are available digitized online. So I pulled some from that, and then the reading list that will get sent out. Basically, if you read all of those books, you will find many, many pictures.
Is there a Google Doc on that prescription? Yeah, we have a Google Doc I shared earlier in the chat, and we'll send out again with kind of all of the resources we've talked about. Patrick, you have a question?
I do. I'm on my bike in the basement, so hopefully it's not too loud. I really liked your comics. I thought those were cool. And obviously, there's a ton of history on comics, in addition to like just crazy stuff going on like in France right now with comics. I'm curious, you know, what's your stance on comics as far as, you know, pushing social justice and things like that?
Well, I think that they're a really amazing medium, and we're really seeing that kind of in how Instagram changed to become social justice slide decks all of a sudden, where, you know, we're in this moment where people don't give their attention to long form work. And comics are a great way to really present a density of ideas and research in a way that's still very digestible. And I think you're right that there's a long history of that, where comics, I think, are deceptively subversive, where you have this simple result, but there's actually so many layers as to what's going on. Actually, on that note, I'm going to be on a panel talking about zines and comics as activism for the Santa Rosa Zine Fest on November 7th. So I'll actually be having a conversation about just that very question with Maya Kobabe, who is the author of the memoir Genderqueer. So if you'd like to hear more in depth about that, I'm going to be on a whole panel about it in about a week and a half.
Awesome. Someone just wanted a little bit more information about your trip across America by bike. Can you get the highlights?
Yeah, you know, it's something that was really, for me, very formative. I rode from Southern California to Maine and was on the road for 4 months. And I paid for a place to stay a grand total of once, and that was by choice. And I basically wanted to get to know my own country better. You know, I grew up in Northern California and had heard basically everyone talk shit about the South, but nobody had ever been there. And so I really wanted to know what that part of America was like, and figured the best way to do that would be to cross it at about 12 miles an hour. And I think pretty much everything about how I view the world comes from that trip, because I had so many experiences of the way in which fear and bubbles kind of move from place to place, where the way that I found places to stay is I would eat snacks outside of grocery stores and talk to people until someone adopted me and was just like, oh, come sleep on my couch or come pitch your tent in my yard. And without fail, everyone would say, oh, it's really good, you know, you met a nice person like me, or we're in this town, which is safe, but the next town over, those are bad people. And I watched that phenomenon of basically 50-mile increments of, once people got outside of their bubble, they were convinced that there was so much to be afraid of. And I think that's really, really stayed with me. It also has given me just a very literal sense of the scale of this country, and how the idea of having unified needs is pretty impossible just based on the topography. And I think it made me really want to kind of focus my life around just talking to people and asking them what their sense of home is and what the questions that guide them are. And also, I really saw firsthand how redlining and segregation play out geographically, because I did this in 2011 and was pretty deliberately trying to not look at screens. So I would just pick up a map when I crossed the state line and pick a cardinal direction and sort of go. So I would end up taking these like really illogical but literal routes through towns and cities, and you would be able to see, you would know when you crossed a red line district, or you could see the economic change. And it really, really impacts the way that I view America and the way that I speak to people. And I think it made me a much more open-minded person. Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting. Can we turn the mic over to Ranan, who has a question?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Tessa. Good to see you again. My question is somewhat off the subject, but the different economic disparities that come to place when it comes to bicycle and the gear you get. And also there was, at least in World War II by the Japanese, there was an evil use of bicycle to mobilize soldiers in different Asian fronts. And I wonder if you looked into that, or if it's something that came to mind when you worked on your piece.
That's not a history that I crossed paths with, but that's fascinating, and that's definitely something I'd like to learn more about. Yeah, definitely. And it kind of was there a first part to your question about economic disparity, or was that more of a comment?
It's a question, because when I grew up, and I grew up in Israel, and it was a clear disparity between who gets, just the usual, maybe a handbrake bike as opposed to the stepping back, and those who got the race bike with the 10 gears. And I I went to different bike trips when I was a teenager, and it was really striking. As for the war, there was World War II. Japanese soldiers, at least in the Philippines, were advancing on bicycle, and of course, after some weeks or whatever, their bicycle, the tires were flat and they didn't have spare parts, so they rode on the metal part. And it says that the villagers heard them from a distance and were so terrified that they ran away for their lives because of what may or may not happen if they are under control. And I'm sure there have been other areas where it was used, I just don't know about.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating. If you have sources on that, I'd love to, send me links. I'd love to read about that. And yeah, to speak to your point about, economic disparity and who gets what kind of bike, I think that's where places like Bike Works, the Bikery, like Bike Kitchens, I love things like that. And that's personally where I feel at home, where I did work as a bike mechanic at a traditional bike store for a while and realized that I hated it because I hate capitalism and I hate upselling and I hate this myth that you need to be wearing full performance wicking fabrics to go ride your bike. And I'm very much of the mindset that you need very little. The only thing you need is a desire to ride your bike. And I really think that places like Bike Works and places that sort of demystify the idea of bikes being complicated or people not being able to work on their own bikes, it's just so liberating to realize that this is a very simple machine and it really doesn't take much to learn everything you need to be able to care for it yourself. And I think that's a huge part of what's so empowering about it is the realization that, you really don't need that much training to become proficient to be able to manage the care of this thing that provides you freedom. And you don't need a lot of money for it.
Well said, Tessa. And for those of you who need a place to start, BikeWorks has both classes and online resources to learn more about bike mechanics and ridership. So I think you all know to come at us if you're looking for those opportunities. I'm going to take two more questions that are already in the chat, and then I think we're going to wrap up. So Maxwell had a question. Are you still with us, Maxwell?
Hey, Tessa. Am I on?
Yes.
All right, sorry. I was wondering if you looked into other ways that people are using the bike as a tool for social justice.
Yeah, so I'm seeing your comment in the chat about food justice, and there, especially with COVID and the way in which that's changed people being able to go to food banks, there's been a lot of work with pairing people on bicycles to be able to deliver food from food banks to people in their homes. If anyone has links on that, I don't know off the top of my head which food banks were doing that, but I know that that's something that's been happening. Also, a group that would be worth looking into is People for Mobility Justice. So they're based out of LA, and there are a lot of kind of new grassroots advocacy orgs that are trying to look at bike advocacy not from an infrastructure perspective, and to look at, again, how it ends up breaking along class and economic lines, where a lot of people are using bikes not as recreation, but because that's their mode of transportation, and looking at, okay, well, what do those people need to be able to use their bikes as their way to get to work, not how do we have a way to safely recreate. So People for Mobility Justice, I would say they're a really good place to start, and they have a lot of resources. Those are the first two that come to mind of other things that I'm aware of.
Maxwell just shared a link to his group, which is the Pedaling Relief Project, that do food delivery to folks who rely on the food bank by bike. So there's that link in the chat to check out.
I'm seeing Jess's comment. Cyclistazine is also there. Yes, they're an amazing resource. They're on Instagram. Their Patreon is just Cyclistazine, and they are a research-heavy intersectional feminist bike zine that has made the most comprehensive Google Doc I have ever seen of bike activism zine links, and it's all online, so support them, check them out. That last page of the comic that I drew has Cyclista Zine and a couple others on there, so I would say that's a good place to start. All of their Instagram handles are on there, so yeah, follow them, see what they're putting out. There's a lot. Another thing that I know that Cyclista Zine has been doing is working with like, for example, the Dirty Kanza was a race that used to happen in Kansas, and that was a racial slur. And so they successfully started a petition to change the name on that, and are doing other advocacy work along those areas. We're sort of looking at ways in which the athletic industry and cycling industry are just not showing up. Oh, also the WTF Bike Explorers, they started this thing called the Cycling Industry Pledge, where they have action items and accountability markers. And I think they have something like over 200 companies that have signed up. So they're doing a lot of stuff around actually trying to get like large corporations and more mainstream brands to do more than post a black square on Instagram. So check out what they're doing there. And that's also on the last page of that comic.
Awesome. Well, I do want to respect everybody's time. We've gone about 10 minutes over. So if you have additional questions, you can let us know. We can reach out to Tessa. We're going to share a lot of resources in a follow-up email, including the recording to this event, which will be posted on YouTube, hopefully tomorrow. And thank you again, Tessa, so much for taking the time to share your research and all the photos you've dug up and just your analysis that looks like you've really woven together a lot of different threads to put a really comprehensive picture together. So everybody should follow Tessa's website and her Instagram and stay in touch with what she's doing next. I believe you're working on a book now?
I am, yes. That's what I've been doing for the last half decade. So yeah, I'm under a book deadline for a nonfiction graphic novel titled Feeding Ghosts, and I am supposed to be working on that and nothing else, but activism is important.
Well, thank you for taking a break from that to speak with us. Everybody should stay tuned. And if you have, I think there were a few more questions. Someone maybe had a question for Ed. You can get in touch with us over at Bikeworks, and we'll do as much follow-up as we can. And thank everybody for their time tonight. Stay safe out there. Ed, do you want to sign us off in any other way?
No, just thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And Tessa, very much big thank yous to you for reaching out and be a part of this tonight. So thank you for everyone for joining us.
All right.
Thank you, Tessa. You've done so much to illuminate us all on what's been going on in Seattle, especially during CHOP. I helped so many other people get real information when they were so brainwashed. And you just, like you said, people had just enough attention span for that. So loved it. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. It was super interesting.